This is the story of not just the greatest Beatle, but also the greatest Briton who ever lived. George Harrison was born the 25th of February in 1943 on 12 Arnold Grove in Liverpool, a house with an outdoor toilet and just one single coal fire providing the heat for the entire house. Harrison's mother, while pregnant with him, frequently tuned in to Radio India, hoping it would bring peace and calm to the unborn George. George had always liked music, but it was only at 13, when he first heard Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel, that he really started to become interested in guitars and rock and roll. In late 1956, George's father, despite being reluctant about his son pursuing a music career, bought him a Dutch Egmont flat-top acoustic guitar. Not long after that, George started his first band, the Rebels, with his brother and a friend, but it never really became anything serious. One day on the bus to school, George met Paul McCartney. The two quickly became friends due to their shared love of music. When Paul joined the band called the Quarrymen with a fellow named John Lennon, he encouraged George to also audition for the band, which he did. However, John thought George, who had just turned 15, was still too young to join the band, so Paul arranged a second meeting to convince John.
So he brought his guitar, and we were on the top deck of a double-decker bus in Liverpool, around where John lived, a place called Wilton. And nobody was on the bus, late at night. And John said, well, go on, and let's see you play, to George. I said, go on, get your guitar out. So George unpacked his guitar, got it out, and he played this thing called Raunchy.
At 16, Harrison dropped out of school to start focusing more on making music. In 1960, the band made their first tour in Scotland with Johnny Gentle, by which time they had changed their name to the Silver Beatles. Harrison toured under the pseudonym of Carl Harrison in honor of Carl Perkins. Later that year, Alan Williams, the band's manager, arranged a residency for the band in Hamburg, where they played at the Kaiserkeller Club. During this time, the band had changed their name to the Beatles, and had recruited Pete Best, a friend from Liverpool, as a drummer. In November of 1961, when the Beatles were back in Liverpool, playing at the Cavern Club, they met Brian Epstein, who they appointed as their manager 2 months later. In 1962, producer George Martin noticed the band and signed them to EMI's Parlophone label. Shortly after, the band's drummer, Pete Best, was let go and replaced by Ringo Starr from Rory, Storm and the Hurricanes. The Beatles' first single, Love Me Do, did fairly well on the charts. They released their first album, Please Please Me, in 1963. The album launched the Beatles' popularity absurdly fast. The phenomenon of their sudden enormous popularity was dubbed Beatlemania.
The Beatles are great, Harvey Edmonds says so! Hey, the Beatles are great! Where the Beatles are great, they're great! Go ahead, Ralph. Go right behind. Wait a minute, hold.
Have you ever been this crazy about any other entertainer?
No, and that's what's so amazing. We don't know why we're like this.
Their second album, With the Beatles, featured one song written by Harrison, Don't Bother Me. On February 7, 1964, the Beatles arrived at New York's John F. Kennedy Airport to a crowd of about 3,000 people. 2 days later, on February 9th, they performed their first U.S. live television performance on The Ed Sullivan Show, performing among others their recent #1 hit, I Wanna Hold Your Hand.
Oh yeah, I'll tell you something I think you'll understand when I say that something. I wanna hold your hand. I wanna hold your hand.
In early 1964, the Beatles received an offer to make a film, which would be called A Hard Day's Night. After the release of the film, they also released the soundtrack album by the same name, which would become their third studio album. During the filming of A Hard Day's Night, Harrison met Pattie Boyd, a model who was cast as a schoolgirl for the film. In early 1965, Harrison and Lennon were dinner guests of their dentist, and for some reason he decided to secretly put LSD in their coffee. They both enjoyed the experience and started using it more frequently. It was this drug, and maybe even this experience, that encouraged Harrison to indulge himself in Indian culture. In June of the same year, Queen Elizabeth II appointed all 4 Beatles members of the Order of the British Empire, an honor that was usually reserved for people like war heroes or important leaders. In 1964 and 65, the Beatles released their next 3 studio albums, Beatles for Sale, Help, and Rubber Soul. The last one received great acclaim and was seen as a major step forward. One of the reasons the album was in such a different style was because of Harrison steering the band more into folk rock through his interests in Bob Dylan and the Byrds. Another reason was marijuana, to which the Beatles were introduced by that same Bob Dylan in 1964. In this period, Harrison also started to become interested in Indian culture and music, which is reflected by his use of the sitar in Norwegian wood. Harrison later called Rubber Soul his favorite Beatles album. On the 21st of January in 1966, Harrison married Pattie Boyd with McCartney as his best man. Beatles' 7th studio album, Revolver, included 3 Harrison compositions, which was more than on any other Beatles records. One of these songs was Love You Too, which was the first Beatles song to clearly show Harrison's developed interest in Indian classical music. Harrison kept experimenting with non-Western instruments, playing tabla, tambura, and swarmandal on Love You Too, Tomorrow Never Knows, and Strawberry Fields Forever, respectively. The latter of these songs was on the band's 8th studio album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, released in 1967. The album is ranked number 1 on Rolling Stone magazine's 500 Greatest Albums of All Time list. Harrison's personal comment on the album was, "It was a millstone and a milestone in the music industry. There's about half the songs I like, and the other half I can't stand." Only a few months after Sgt. Pepper's, the psychedelic album Magical Mystery Tour was released as another soundtrack album of a film by the same name. In February of 1968, the Beatles made a trip to India to study under a Maharishi, greatly encouraged by Harrison, of course. The other band members also started getting interested in Indian culture though, especially after their use of psychedelic drugs such as LSD. During their stay in India, they were quite productive and wrote lots of songs, which appeared on later Beatles and solo albums. Something else that occurred in this period was the death of Brian Epstein, the Beatles' manager, as a result of an accidental medical drug overdose. The manager's death hit the band hard and was an important cause of their eventual breakup. When the Beatles returned from India, they started working on their next album. However, tensions were running high within the group, especially since Lennon started bringing his new girlfriend, Yoko Ono, to recording sessions and urging the band to let her assist them, breaking the rule they had established of not letting wives or girlfriends into the studio. Harrison's irritation was particularly growing because for some time already he had been writing a lot more and better, but he still couldn't get Lennon and McCartney to give him some more space on the albums. He badly needed a creative outlet, so in November of 1968 he released his first solo album, Wonderwall Music. The album is now seen as an early example of what is now called world music. Not even a month after the release of Harrison's solo album, the Beatles released their 9th studio album, The Beatles, also called the White Album due to its cover. Harrison contributed the popular song While My Guitar Gently Weeps to the album, featuring Eric Clapton on lead guitar. In early 1969, the relationships within the band worsened. Even the ever-successful Lennon-McCartney duo couldn't cooperate at all. This led to Harrison leaving the band for a short period. A few months after he returned to the band, he released his second solo album, Electronic Sound, an experimental album featuring nothing but a Moog synthesizer. The Beatles released 3 more albums before their breakup, Yellow Submarine and Abbey Road in 1969 and Let It Be in 1970. Abbey Road included Harrison's Here Comes the Sun and Something, the second of which became Harrison's first #1 hit. Let It Be included his second #1 hit, For You Blue. Lennon had already left the band 6 days before the release of Abbey Road, because he'd gained success with his and Ono's band, the Plastic Ono Band. He had promised not to announce his departure in public yet though, to prevent disturbing the sales of the mostly recorded but then still unreleased albums. McCartney publicly announced his departure from the band on April 10, 1970, which marked the definitive end of the Beatles.
start with you. Oh, John Lennon, oh, George Harrison. Krishna, 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 Krishna. May the Lord help this to become final.
The small gathering on Savile Row is only the beginning. The event is so momentous that historians may one day view it as a landmark in the decline of the British Empire. The Beatles are breaking up.
Right after the Beatles' breakup, Harrison released a triple album called All Things Must Pass. It featured the #1 single My Sweet Lord and What Is Life. The album received great critical acclaim. In early 1971, an old friend of Harrison's, Ravi Shankar, approached Harrison about the Bangladesh Liberation War and the horrors it brought with it. Harrison decided to organize a benefit concert to raise money and awareness for Bangladesh. The concert was the first benefit concert of such magnitude. It featured some really big artists and raised almost $250,000. The concert was also an inspiration for later big benefit concerts such as Live Aid.
I'd just like to say before we start off with the concert, to thank you all for coming here.
Mr. Harrison, with all of the enormous problems in the world, how did you happen to choose this one?
Because I was asked by a friend if I'd help, you know, that's all.
War was going on between Pakistan and Eastern Pakistan, it was then known. That's where I belong to. And all the women and children suffering and all that made me feel very concerned. And George immediately felt that he would help.
Like to bring on a friend of us all, Mr. Bob Dylan.
The most memorable thing really was the fact that it came off and that it worked.
It is a great thing that can be done, and it was the first of its kind which set an example.
Immense success artistically, and you know, again, I use the word spiritually because he decided he would use this great ability he had for another reason.
There was a lot of kids and just general public who, having had the inspiration, all started collecting money and were banging on UNICEF doors saying, what can we do to help?
These things will always be remembered as times that we could be proud of being musicians, you know. We actually just weren't thinking of ourselves for 5 minutes. We were doing something for a bigger issue, and we need that.
In 1973, Harrison released his album Living in the Material World, which reached #1 and featured the hit single Give Me Love. After the success of his first 2 post-Beatles solo albums, he released 2 less successful ones, Dark Horse and Extra Texture, released in 1974 and 75 respectively. They were mainly the result of a depression caused by failed tours and releases and a period of heavy cocaine and alcohol use. Even though the albums themselves kind of flopped, Harrison's single You from Extra Texture reached the top 20. During this period, Harrison also divorced his wife, Pattie Boyd, but met Olivia Arias not long after their separation. She was a secretary at Harrison's new record company, Dark Horse Records. In 1976, Harrison released 33 1/3, which was his first album under his own new label. The album included 2 hits, This Song and Crackerbox Palace, and it received positive reviews again. In 1978, Harrison married Olivia Arias and got a son, Danny Harrison. A year later, he released George Harrison as his 8th studio album. In 1980, when John Lennon was murdered, Harrison modified the lyrics of a song he wrote for Starr to make it a tribute song to Lennon, called All Those Years Ago, featuring Starr on the drums and additional vocals by both Paul and Linda McCartney. Harrison released Somewhere in England and Gone Troppo in 81 and 82, but they didn't draw much attention, which discouraged him from releasing any albums for a while. He did, however, perform at a Carl Perkins tribute concert and 2 charity concerts. In 1987, Harrison finally released another album again, called Cloud 9, on which he performed a cover of James Ray's Got My Mind Set on You, reaching #1. In 1988, Harrison formed the supergroup The Traveling Wilburys, with Bob Dylan, Tom Petty, Roy Orbison and Jeff Lynne. They released 2 albums, The Traveling Wilburys Volume 1 and The Traveling Wilburys Volume 3. The latter was without Orbison, as he sadly passed away shortly after the first album. On December 30th in 1999, Harrison was attacked with a kitchen knife by someone who broke into his house. Harrison's wife Olivia was eventually able to incapacitate his assailant with a fire iron and a lamp, but not until Harrison had suffered 40 stab wounds. However, Harrison survived the attack and didn't suffer any permanent damage. Nonetheless, he died of throat cancer 2 years later, for which he blamed his years of smoking. A year after his death, a tribute concert was held at the Royal Albert Hall in London, featuring artists such as Eric Clapton, Tom Petty, and his former bandmates Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr. So vote for the man who was underestimated first as an artist, then as a songwriter, but ultimately managed to prove his worth in both categories. Vote for the man who devoted so much of his time aiding not only his friends, but also complete strangers. Vote for the man who stands for his beliefs. Vote for George Harrison.